Catherine Davio. On December 11, 2008, firefighters responded to reports of a fire in Montreal's Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie borough. Upon entering the apartment, they discovered 26-year-old Catherine Davio in her bed, having been strangled. The scene showed signs of a struggle, and forensic evidence suggested she had been harmed before the fire was set. The perpetrator had attempted to destroy evidence by starting the fire. But investigators were able to preserve crucial biological material from the scene that would prove essential 17 years later. Catherine had distinctive features that those who knew her remembered clearly. Blonde hair and blue eyes that made her easily recognizable in their neighborhood. In the days before her passing, she had posted an online advertisement to sell her vehicle, a seemingly innocent action that would connect her to someone with deadly intentions. The apartment's doors were locked with no signs of forced entry, suggesting Catherine had known her attacker and admitted them willingly, never suspecting the danger they represented. Jacques Bolduc had contacted Catherine about the vehicle advertisement days before she lost her life. His interest in purchasing the car provided the pretext for making contact and potentially gaining access to her apartment. Bolduc already had a criminal history involving armed incidents and attempted harm to others, demonstrating a pattern of dangerous behavior. When investigators began looking into Catherine's final days and the people she had interacted with, Bolduc emerged as an early suspect based on witness accounts and the timeline of events. However, technology in 2008 had limitations that prevented investigators from definitively linking Bolduc to the scene. DNA profiles were created from biological evidence found in the apartment, including material from a cigarette butt. But when these profiles were run through national databases, they didn't produce any matches. Over 100 samples were collected and tested, with investigators pursuing every possible lead. Despite their efforts, the case went cold as months turned into years without a breakthrough. Bolduc continued his criminal activities after Catherine's passing. He was eventually arrested and convicted for armed offenses and attempting to take lives, receiving a prison sentence for those crimes. While incarcerated, he never faced charges related to Catherine's case because the evidence linking him to the scene remained circumstantial. In 2021, while still in prison serving his sentence for other offenses, Bolduc passed away. His passing occurred before DNA technology advances would finally connect him to Catherine's apartment on that December night in 2008. The Montreal Police Service didn't give up on Catherine's case. In 2021, investigators began using genetic genealogy techniques, a revolutionary approach that had started solving cold cases across North America. This method involves using DNA from crime scenes to search for familial matches in genealogy databases, then building family trees to identify potential suspects. The process is painstaking, requiring specialists to trace genetic connections through multiple generations until they narrow down to specific individuals. In August 2025, after years of genetic research and database comparisons, Quebec's forensic laboratory confirmed that the DNA from Catherine's apartment matched Jacques Bolduc. The 17-year-old mystery had finally been solved through scientific advancement that didn't exist when Catherine lost her life. Melanie Dupont, chief of Montreal Police's Major Crimes Unit, stated, "It was ultimately through genetic genealogy that the individual responsible was confirmed," emphasizing how crucial this new technology had been in providing answers. Suzanne Marchand, laboratory director, highlighted how innovative DNA techniques provided hope for unsolved cases. Because Bolduc had passed away years before being identified as Catherine's attacker, no trial could occur. The criminal justice system requires living defendants to face charges, meaning Catherine's family would never see anyone held accountable in court. However, the definitive identification provided something perhaps equally important: certainty. after 17 years of wondering who had taken Catherine from them and why. Her loved ones finally had answers. The case was officially closed with the perpetrator identified, even if he would never face earthly justice for what he had done. But one case would require overturning decades of injustice before the truth could emerge. Teresa Fusco. In November 1984, 16-year-old Teresa Fusco from Lynbrook, New York, lost her job at Hot Skates roller rink. Shortly afterward, she disappeared, sparking fears across Long Island's South Shore. When her body was discovered buried under leaves and pallets, the community's worst fears were confirmed. She had been strangled, harmed in the most horrific ways, and beaten. The incident became part of what locals called the Lynbrook Triangle disappearances, a series of cases that terrorized the area during that period. The investigation that followed would become one of the most troubling chapters in Long Island criminal justice history. Pressure to solve the case mounted as public fear grew. Police focused their attention on 3 men from the community, building cases against them despite questions about the evidence. John Restivo, John Kogut, and Dennis Halstead were arrested, tried, and convicted of taking Teresa's life. All 3 maintained their innocence throughout the proceedings, insisting that they had been wrongly accused and that the real perpetrator remained free. The 3 men spent the next 18 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. During that time, advances in DNA testing became available that hadn't existed when they were tried. When biological evidence from Teresa's case was finally tested using these new methods, the results were shocking. None of the 3 convicted men's DNA matched the material recovered from the scene. In 2003, after nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment, Restivo, Kogut, and Halstead were exonerated. Their convictions were overturned, and they walked free. But those years stolen from them could never be returned. The exoneration created a new problem. If these 3 men hadn't harmed Teresa, who had? The DNA profile from the scene was entered into databases. But for years it produced no matches. The case remained unsolved, with Teresa's family knowing that justice hadn't been served and that whoever actually took their daughter's life remained unidentified. The wrongful convictions had not only destroyed 3 innocent lives, but had also allowed the true perpetrator to evade accountability for decades. 23-year-old Richard Bilodeau had been living near Teresa in 1984. He was never seriously investigated during the original proceedings, with police focusing their attention elsewhere. After the exonerations, cold case investigators began reviewing all aspects of Teresa's final days, looking for suspects who might have been overlooked. Bilodeau's name surfaced, but without probable cause for obtaining his DNA directly, investigators needed another approach. The break came through patient surveillance and modern forensic techniques. In 2025, investigators observed Bilodeau, now 63 years old, discard a smoothie straw. They retrieved this item from the trash, extracting DNA from the saliva Bilodeau had left behind. When this DNA profile was compared to the biological evidence from Teresa's case, it matched. After 41 years, the person who had actually taken Teresa's life had been identified through something as simple as a discarded straw. District Attorney Ann Donnelly announced, "The DNA in this case led us straight to Richard Bilodeau," marking the end of 4 decades of uncertainty. During questioning, Bilodeau made a statement that revealed much about his mindset. He reportedly told investigators that people got away with things back in the 1980s, suggesting he believed he had successfully evaded justice for all those years. His flippant attitude demonstrated a lack of remorse and a belief that time had made him untouchable. Bilodeau was charged with second-degree offenses in October 2025. He entered a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for a trial that would finally bring the case before a jury with the actual perpetrator in the defendant's chair. As of the latest reports, legal proceedings continue as prosecutors prepare to present the DNA evidence alongside other investigative findings accumulated over 4 decades. For John Restivo, the arrest brought mixed emotions. He reflected on his exoneration, stating, "I woke up on the right side of the wall this morning," a reference to finally being free after years of wrongful imprisonment. His words captured both relief at his own freedom and likely frustration that the real perpetrator had remained free all those years, while 3 innocent men suffered. Restivo, Kogut, and Halstead had their lives irrevocably changed by a justice system that prioritized solving the case over ensuring they had the right person. Teresa's family endured multiple layers of trauma. Losing their daughter to someone's cruel actions, believing justice had been served only to learn years later that the wrong men had been convicted, then waiting another 22 years for the actual perpetrator to be identified. The case stands as both a triumph of modern forensic science and a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment under public pressure. The DNA technology that exonerated 3 innocent men eventually identified the guilty party, but only after decades of injustice. The next case would show how a simple letter held the key to a long-hidden truth. Cynthia McKenna. On February 27, 2007, emergency responders arrived at an apartment in North Providence, Rhode Island, to find 49-year-old Cynthia McKenna unresponsive. She had lost her life through asphyxiation, a determination made after medical examination. The scene suggested this wasn't an accident or natural causes, but investigators faced the challenge of determining who had been responsible and what had led to Cynthia's final moments. Cynthia's personal life became central to the investigation. She had been in a troubled relationship with Robert Corey Jr., marked by incidents that had previously brought law enforcement to their door. Domestic situations had occurred between them, documented through prior calls and reports. This history made Corey a person of interest, but establishing his exact movements around the time of Cynthia's passing proved challenging. He had gaps in his timeline that couldn't be fully accounted for, raising suspicions, but not providing definitive proof. The case took an unusual turn when prison authorities intercepted letters that Corey had written. Inmates' correspondence is routinely monitored, and staff flagged communications from Corey that contained disturbing content. In these letters, Corey appeared to confess to taking Cynthia's life, providing details that only someone involved would know. However, written confessions alone can be problematic in court, as defense attorneys can argue they were coerced, fabricated, or written by someone else. Investigators needed corroborating evidence to strengthen the case against Corey. Before prosecutors could build a case around the confession letters, circumstances intervened. Corey passed away in 2014. 7 years after Cynthia's life ended, and while questions about his involvement still lingered. His passing meant that even with the confession letters, he would never face trial. The case remained officially unsolved, with Cynthia's family knowing that Corey had likely been responsible, but unable to see formal justice served. The investigation might have ended there, with Corey deceased and no prospect of prosecution. However, cold case investigators recognized that the confession letters represented a unique opportunity. Corey had sealed and mailed these letters, which meant he had licked the envelopes to close them. That saliva potentially contained DNA that could be extracted and tested years later, providing scientific confirmation to support what the written words suggested. In 2024, 17 years after Cynthia's passing, investigators submitted the envelope flaps for DNA testing. Advances in extraction techniques meant that even small amounts of biological material could yield usable genetic profiles. The lab successfully recovered DNA from where Corey had sealed the envelopes. This profile was then compared to genetic material collected from Cynthia's case. Additionally, investigators used genetic genealogy techniques, comparing the DNA to family members to confirm the identification through multiple lines of evidence. The DNA matched. The person who had written confession letters about Cynthia's passing was definitively confirmed as Robert Corey Jr. through scientific testing. The biological evidence from the envelopes, combined with the content of the letters themselves and the documented history between Cynthia and Corey, provided conclusive proof of his involvement. The case was officially solved and closed in 2025, giving Cynthia's family the answers they had sought for 18 years. Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Naranja stated, "This case represents the best of our collaborative efforts," praising the work of investigators who had preserved evidence and pursued every available avenue. His comments acknowledged that while Corey's passing meant no trial would occur, the scientific confirmation provided closure that hadn't been possible through the confession letters alone. The collaboration between traditional detective work and modern forensic science had solved a case that might otherwise have remained officially unsolved forever. Jacqueline McKenna, Cynthia's daughter, expressed appreciation for finally having answers despite the absence of an arrest and trial. She had lived with uncertainty about what happened to her mother and who was responsible. The DNA confirmation from the confession letters gave her certainty, even if the justice system couldn't provide the courtroom accountability she might have preferred. Knowing definitively that Corey had been responsible allowed her to process her mother's loss with complete information rather than lingering questions. Sometimes the perpetrator is hiding in plain sight, closer to the victim than anyone suspected. Leslie Preer. On May 9, 2001, Leslie Preer was harmed in her Chevy Chase, Maryland, home following what would later be described as the perpetrator's substance-fueled episode. The scene showed no signs of forced entry, indicating Leslie had admitted her attacker willingly, never suspecting the danger that person represented. After taking her life, the perpetrator attempted to clean the scene, removing obvious traces of what had occurred in an effort to avoid detection. The person responsible was someone Leslie's family knew well, Eugene Gligor, who had previously been in a relationship with Leslie's daughter. His connection to the family meant he had legitimate reasons to visit the home and wouldn't have raised immediate suspicion. Gligor's own background included traumatic experiences during his developmental years, circumstances that may have contributed to his psychological state, but certainly didn't excuse his actions on that May morning. The investigation immediately focused on people close to Leslie, as the lack of forced entry suggested she knew whoever harmed her. Gligor was questioned along with others in Leslie's circle. But without physical evidence directly linking him to the scene, investigators couldn't make an arrest. The case grew cold as months passed without a breakthrough. Leslie's family was left with suspicions, but no proof, forced to continue interacting with Gligor at family gatherings despite their concerns, unable to definitively accuse him without evidence. For 23 years, the case remained unsolved. Leslie's daughter, Lauren Preer, grew up knowing her mother had been taken from her, but not knowing for certain who had done it. The uncertainty affected every aspect of her life, particularly during moments when she encountered Gligor and wondered if the man before her had taken her mother's life. The inability to achieve justice or even confirmation of what happened created a wound that couldn't heal. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy, the same technique that had solved numerous other cold cases. In 2024, investigators used preserved DNA evidence from Leslie's case to build a genetic family tree. This painstaking process involved comparing the crime scene DNA to profiles in genealogy databases, identifying distant relatives, then working forward through family trees to identify specific individuals. The trail led directly to Eugene Gligor, confirming what some family members had long suspected but couldn't prove. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Gligor recognized he had no viable defense. He accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to second-degree charges in 2024. This plea allowed him to avoid a trial where prosecutors would have presented the full scope of evidence, including forensic findings and the history of his relationship with the family. Sentencing took place in 2025, with Gligor receiving 22 years in prison. During sentencing proceedings, Lauren Preer delivered a victim impact statement, describing Gligor as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Her words captured how Gligor had hidden his dangerous nature behind a facade of normalcy, gaining trust and access to their family while concealing what he had done. The statement reflected years of suspicion finally confirmed, anger at the decades of deception, and grief for the mother she had lost when she was young. Gligor expressed remorse during the proceedings, claiming he had no memory of the incident due to being in a state where he couldn't form clear recollections. Whether this claim was genuine or a legal strategy remained unclear. The assertion that he couldn't remember harming Leslie rang hollow to those who had watched him maintain his innocence for over 2 decades. If he truly had no memory of the incident, he had certainly remembered to clean the scene and conceal his involvement, suggesting more awareness than his statement implied. Across state lines, another family maintained their own vigil for answers. Jennifer Williams. On September 8, 1989, 18-year-old Jennifer Williams was dropped off at her Springfield, Missouri, home after spending time with friends. It was an ordinary evening that ended with what seemed like a routine goodbye. Jennifer entered her home, and those who had brought her there drove away, having no reason to suspect anything was wrong. That would be the last time anyone who loved her would see Jennifer alive. When Jennifer failed to make contact over the following days, concern grew into alarm. Family and friends searched the areas she frequented, hoping to find some indication of where she might have gone. On September 20th, 1989, Jennifer's body was discovered. She had been harmed in multiple ways before her life ended, including being subjected to the worst kinds of mistreatment. The location where she was found and the condition of her remains made clear that this was a deliberate act of extreme cruelty. The Springfield Police Department launched an extensive investigation, interviewing everyone who had known Jennifer or might have crossed paths with her during her final days. They collected physical evidence from where her body was found, preserving biological materials in hopes that future technology might eventually help identify who had done this. In 1989, DNA testing was in its infancy, with limitations that prevented investigators from creating detailed profiles or making the kinds of comparisons that would later become routine. Years passed with no breakthrough. The case files remained active, but without new leads or technological capabilities to re-examine old evidence, investigators had nowhere to turn. Jennifer's family marked birthdays she would never celebrate, holidays without her presence, and life milestones she should have reached. They maintained hope that someday, somehow, they would get answers about what happened to Jennifer and who had taken her from them. The opportunity for renewed investigation came through federal funding programs designed to help law enforcement agencies solve cold cases using modern forensic techniques. Springfield authorities received grants that specifically allowed them to fund retesting of preserved evidence using current DNA analysis methods. These grants recognized that many agencies had cases like Jennifer's where evidence existed but hadn't been examined with the full capabilities of contemporary science. The funding provided resources that local budgets couldn't always support, giving cold cases a second chance at resolution. In 2024, 35 years after Jennifer's life ended, forensic laboratories re-examined the biological evidence from her case using advanced DNA profiling techniques. These modern methods could extract usable genetic information from smaller or degraded samples than older techniques required. They could also create more detailed profiles that increased likelihood of finding matches when compared against databases. The retesting produced a DNA profile that could be compared to known offenders and submitted to genetic genealogy services. The DNA analysis identified 62-year-old Paul Bowles as matching the biological evidence from Jennifer's case. Bowles had been living in the area in 1989 and would have been 26 years old when Jennifer lost her life. Whether he had known Jennifer or their paths had crossed by chance remained unclear from available information. The motive for why Bowles targeted Jennifer and subjected her to such harm has not been publicly stated, leaving questions about what drove this particular act of cruelty. In 2025, a grand jury indicted Bowles on multiple charges, including offenses related to taking a life and the mistreatment Jennifer endured. The indictment represented the first formal charges filed in Jennifer's case since 1989, moving the matter from cold case status to active prosecution. Bowles faces trial, where prosecutors will present the DNA evidence alongside any other investigative findings accumulated over 3.5 decades. Springfield authorities have encouraged anyone with information about Jennifer's final days or about Bowles' activities in 1989 to come forward. Even after all these years, witnesses who might have seen something relevant or heard something significant could provide additional context to strengthen the prosecution's case. While the DNA evidence forms the core of the charges against Bowles, corroborating testimony or additional physical evidence could help ensure justice is achieved. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The power of DNA technology extends across borders and decades, reaching cases once thought impossible to solve. Donna Oglev. In March 1998, 24-year-old Donna Oglev had recently relocated to Toronto, Ontario, from British Columbia. She was beginning a new chapter in her life, pregnant and looking forward to the future. That future was stolen when Donna was strangled in a parking lot, her life ending in a moment of terrible cruelty. The circumstances surrounding her final hours remained unclear, with investigators unable to determine exactly what had led her to that parking lot or who had been waiting there. The investigation faced immediate challenges. Without witnesses who could provide detailed accounts of what happened or clear forensic leads pointing to a specific suspect, investigators collected what evidence they could from the scene and began the painstaking process of trying to identify who had taken Donna's life. DNA material was preserved, following standard protocols. But in 1998, the technology to analyze and compare genetic material had significant limitations compared to what would become available in subsequent decades. Years passed with no breakthrough. Donna's family marked anniversaries of her passing without answers, wondering who had done this and why. Her unborn child never had the chance to enter the world, a loss that compounded the tragedy. The case file remained open but cold, with investigators having exhausted traditional investigative methods and waiting for some new development that might provide the lead they needed. The breakthrough would come through a specialized forensic genealogy laboratory called Othram, which has become instrumental in solving cold cases across North America. Othram uses advanced DNA sequencing techniques that can extract usable genetic information from degraded or limited samples that older methods couldn't process effectively. The laboratory began working on Donna's case, using genetic genealogy methods to build family trees from the DNA evidence. The genetic genealogy process is complex and time-consuming. Analysts upload DNA profiles to genealogy databases where people have voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about their ancestry. When the crime scene DNA matches distant relatives in these databases, genealogists build family trees working forward through generations to identify specific individuals who could be the source of the crime scene DNA. This process can take months or even years, requiring extensive research through public records, family histories, and genealogical documents. Through this process, investigators identified Ronald Gordon Ackerman as matching the DNA profile from Donna's case. Ackerman would have been in his mid-20s in 1998, roughly the same age as Donna. Whether he had known Donna or their encounter had been random remained unclear from publicly available information. The motive for why Ackerman targeted Donna, particularly given her vulnerable state, has not been stated by authorities. Between 2022 and 2025, as the genetic genealogy investigation progressed and evidence accumulated, authorities prepared to make an arrest. In 2025, Ackerman, now 50 years old, was taken into custody and charged with first-degree offenses related to Donna's passing. The charge reflects prosecutors' belief that the evidence supports showing premeditation and intent, the highest level of criminal responsibility under Canadian law. As of the latest reports, Ackerman's case is proceeding through the court system. He faces trial where prosecutors will present the DNA evidence alongside any other investigative findings from the original case and the subsequent cold case investigation. The genetic genealogy evidence will be central to establishing that Ackerman was present at the scene, connecting him directly to what happened to Donna in that parking lot 27 years ago. For Donna's family, the arrest brings both relief and renewed grief. After 27 years of uncertainty, they finally know who took Donna and her unborn child from them. However, that knowledge comes with the reopening of old wounds and the prospect of sitting through a trial where they'll hear details about Donna's final moments. The justice system will now determine whether the DNA evidence and other investigative findings are sufficient to convict Ackerman, providing legal closure to match the investigative resolution. But some perpetrators never face trial, taking their secrets to the grave. Deborah Lee Miller. On August 23, 1981, 20-year-old Deborah Lee Miller was a new mother trying to build a life for herself and her young child in Mansfield, Ohio. That summer day would be her last. Deborah was attacked, stabbed multiple times, and subjected to horrific mistreatment before her life ended. Her body was discovered in a wooded area, the condition of her remains making clear the violent nature of what had been done to her. The investigation in 1981 faced the technological limitations of that era. DNA testing as we know it today didn't exist yet, and forensic science relied on blood typing, fingerprints, and other methods that couldn't provide the detailed individual identification that genetic analysis would later make possible. Investigators collected evidence and pursued leads, interviewing people who had known Deborah and anyone who might have seen something relevant. But no arrest was made. The case went cold, joining the growing files of unsolved homicides that haunted law enforcement agencies across the country. Deborah's case haunted the Mansfield community for 43 years. Her family never stopped hoping for answers, even as decades passed, and the likelihood of resolution seemed to diminish with each passing year. Investigators periodically reviewed the case, looking for anything they might have missed. But without new leads or the ability to retest evidence with better technology, they had nowhere to turn. The breakthrough came when cold case investigators decided to resubmit preserved evidence from Deborah's case for modern DNA analysis. The samples that had been collected in 1981, carefully stored for over 4 decades, could now be examined with techniques that didn't exist when they were originally gathered. Advanced DNA profiling methods extracted genetic information and created a profile that could be compared against databases. The DNA profile was run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System that contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes across the United States. When law enforcement discovered a match, it pointed to James Van Est, who would have been in his 40s in 1981 and was now in his late 60s. Van Est had a criminal history that hadn't connected him to Deborah's case during the original investigation. But the DNA evidence now definitively placed him at the scene. When investigators moved to arrest Van Est in 2024, the situation escalated dramatically. Rather than surrender to authorities, Van Est engaged in a confrontation that resulted in his passing. The circumstances of this final encounter meant that Van Est would never face trial for what he had done to Deborah. He took whatever specific knowledge he had about that August day in 1981 to his grave, including details about whether he had targeted Deborah specifically or if their encounter had been opportunistic. Sheriff J. Steed Sheldon addressed the resolution, stating, "This case haunted our community for over 4 decades. And while we cannot bring Deborah back, we can provide answers to her family. Science has finally caught up to give them the truth they've deserved." His words acknowledged both the satisfaction of solving the case and the frustration that Van Est's passing meant no trial could occur. The community had waited 43 years to know who had taken Deborah from them, only to learn the answer after that person could no longer be held accountable in court. Deborah's brother, John Miller, provided a family perspective on the resolution. "Knowing who did this brings pain, but also peace. We've lived with questions for so long, and while nothing can bring Deborah back, at least now we know the truth." His statement captured the complex emotions that accompany cold case resolutions when the perpetrator is deceased. There's relief in finally having answers and confirmation that investigators have identified the responsible party. But there's also disappointment that formal justice through trial and conviction remains forever out of reach. Deborah's young child grew up without a mother, never knowing the woman who had given birth to them. That child became an adult, perhaps had their own family, all while Deborah's case remained unsolved and Van Est walked free. The decades of delay meant that multiple generations of Deborah's family lived with unanswered questions, affecting family dynamics and leaving a wound that couldn't heal without knowledge of who had been responsible. Nature trails can hide terrible secrets for decades. Maria Weidhofer. On November 16, 1990, 32-year-old Maria Weidhofer went for what should have been a peaceful walk on a trail in Tilden Park, California. Maria was an artist and baker, someone who contributed beauty to the world through her creative work. The trail she chose that day was popular with locals, considered safe during daylight hours. What happened to Maria during her walk would terrorize the community and remain unsolved for 35 years. Maria was attacked on the trail, subjected to the worst kinds of mistreatment, then strangled. Her body was discovered by other trail users, the location and condition making clear this hadn't been an accident, but a deliberate act of cruelty. The park setting meant fewer witnesses than might have been available in an urban environment. And the perpetrator had chosen or stumbled upon a victim who was vulnerable and isolated at that particular moment. The investigation pursued various leads, interviewing regular park users and anyone who had been in the area that day. Forensic evidence was collected, including biological material that could be preserved for potential future testing. However, DNA technology in 1990 was still developing, with limitations on what could be extracted from samples and how those samples could be compared. The case generated significant publicity, given the location and the nature of the attack. But no arrest was made. Maria's case joined the ranks of unsolved homicides that frustrated investigators and haunted communities. Maria's family, including her brother Hans Weidhofer, maintained hope that someday technology would advance enough to solve the case. They kept her memory alive while dealing with the uncertainty of not knowing who had taken her life or why. The park where Maria had been attacked continued to be used by hikers and nature enthusiasts, though her case remained a cautionary reminder that even seemingly safe public spaces could harbor danger. The breakthrough came through advanced DNA analysis and collaboration with federal authorities. The preserved biological evidence from Maria's case was re-examined using modern techniques, producing a detailed genetic profile. This profile was analyzed with FBI assistance, using genetic genealogy methods to identify potential suspects through familial DNA matching. The process led investigators to John Lipari, who would have been in his mid-30s at the time of Maria's passing. Further investigation revealed that Lipari had taken his own life in 2023, 2 years before being identified as Maria's attacker. His passing meant he would never face criminal charges or trial for what he had done to Maria. However, investigators were confident in the DNA match and comfortable publicly identifying Lipari as the person responsible, providing Maria's family with definitive answers, even though legal proceedings couldn't occur. Hans Weidhofer released a statement addressing the resolution. "This case was irreparably harmful to our family, affecting us in ways that are difficult to express. We express our deepest gratitude for the closure this identification brings, even though we wish the circumstances were different." His carefully worded response acknowledged the pain of 3.5 decades without answers, while also recognizing that knowing Lipari's identity provided something valuable, even without a trial. General Manager Sabrina Landreth of the East Bay Regional Park District stated, "We never gave up on finding who was responsible for Maria's passing. This resolution demonstrates our commitment to justice and to the safety of everyone who uses our parks." Her statement emphasized that even decades-old cases remained priorities for park authorities and law enforcement, sending a message that perpetrators couldn't count on simply outlasting investigations. Some cases reach back further than anyone thought DNA could touch. Carol Ann Doherty. On October 22, 1962, 9-year-old Carol Ann Doherty left her home in Bristol, Pennsylvania, planning to walk to the local library. It was an ordinary errand for a child in that era, when kids often walked places independently. Carol Ann never reached the library. Her small body was discovered at a church, where she had been subjected to horrific mistreatment before being strangled. The case shocked the community and generated extensive investigation. But 60s-era forensics couldn't provide the answers investigators needed. The investigation pursued numerous leads, interviewing potential suspects and collecting what physical evidence was available. Among the biological evidence preserved was a single hair sample that would prove crucial 6 decades later. Without the technology to extract DNA from such samples, investigators could only document its existence and hope that future science might eventually unlock its secrets. The case went cold despite the community's determination to find who had harmed Carol Ann. Carol Ann's family lived with the horror of not knowing who had taken her or why. Her sister Kay grew up in the shadow of Carol Ann's unsolved case, the mystery affecting family dynamics and leaving questions that seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. As decades passed and investigators who had worked the original case retired or passed away themselves, the likelihood of resolution appeared to diminish to nearly zero. The preservation of that hair sample proved to be crucial. In 2025, 63 years after Carol Ann's life ended, Advances in DNA extraction technology had progressed to the point where genetic material could be recovered from samples that previous generations of forensic scientists couldn't have processed. The hair was submitted for analysis using cutting-edge techniques, successfully producing a DNA profile. The DNA profile pointed to William Schrader, who had been 20 years old in 1962. Investigation into Schrader's background revealed a concerning history. He had been involved in other incidents targeting young females, demonstrating a pattern of predatory behavior. However, Schrader had passed away in 1996, nearly 30 years before being identified as Carol Ann's attacker. He had lived free for 34 years after taking Carol Ann's life, never facing consequences for what he had done. District Attorney Jennifer Shorn addressed the resolution, describing Schrader as a predator whose prey was little girls. Her blunt assessment captured the nature of Schrader's crimes and the danger he had posed to children. The fact that he had other victims or potential victims in his history suggested Carol Ann might not have been his only target, raising questions about whether other unsolved cases from that era might also connect to him. Kay, Carol Ann's sister, provided a family statement. This case was unsolved for 63 years, longer than Carol Ann lived by more than 6 decades. Finally knowing who took her brings closure we never thought we'd receive. Her words reflected the extraordinary length of time the family had waited for answers. Kay had lived her entire life under the shadow of her sister's unsolved case, processing childhood trauma while wondering if she would ever know the truth about what happened to Carol Ann. The Doherty case represents the oldest cold case resolution in this survey, demonstrating that even cases from the early 1960s can be solved using modern DNA technology. The fact that a single hair preserved for over 60 years could yield usable genetic information shows how far forensic science has advanced. Investigators in 1962, who carefully documented and stored that hair, couldn't have imagined the technology that would eventually extract DNA from it. But their diligence in preserving evidence made the resolution possible. The resolution came too late to prosecute Schrader, but it provided confirmation that investigators had identified the right person and that Carol Ann's family could finally have certainty. The case closes with scientific proof of Schrader's guilt, even if legal accountability remained forever out of reach. Carol Ann, who never had the chance to grow up, experience life's milestones, or have her own family, is remembered not just as a victim, but as a person whose case finally received the resolution her family deserved. The final case brings us to a scene that told its own cryptic story. Stephen Edenfield. On February 1, 1997, Stephen Edenfield returned to his Tampa, Florida condominium after being away. What happened next would leave investigators with a brutal crime scene and a mysterious message that seemed to point to motive, but ultimately provided more questions than answers. Stephen was attacked with extreme violence, both stabbed and beaten. The ferocity of the attack suggested rage or determination to ensure he wouldn't survive. The most unusual aspect of the crime scene was a word written in blood: greed. This message appeared to be left deliberately by the perpetrator, perhaps as a statement about motive or a way to mislead investigators. The word raised immediate questions. Had Stephen been involved in financial dealings that motivated someone to harm him? Was the message literal, suggesting greed as the motive? Or was it meant to point investigators in the wrong direction? The cryptic nature of the message added a layer of complexity to an already difficult investigation. Investigators examined Stephen's life, looking for financial disputes, business conflicts, or personal relationships that might explain the greed message and identify who had wanted him dead. Physical evidence was collected from the scene, including biological material from the perpetrator. However, without suspects to compare that evidence against, and with the limitations of 1990s DNA technology, the case stalled. The greed message remained unexplained, and Stephen's case went cold despite the unusual clue left at the scene. The breakthrough came through modern DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. The biological evidence from Stephen's condo was re-examined using advanced techniques, producing a detailed genetic profile. This profile was submitted to Othram, the specialized forensic genealogy laboratory, which used its proprietary methods to build family trees and identify potential suspects. The investigation led to Brandon Gliha, who would have been in his late teens or early 20s in 1997, and was now 47 years old. When investigators approached Gliha with the DNA evidence, he made a decision that surprised them. Rather than deny involvement or demand legal representation, Gliha confessed to taking Stephen's life. His confession provided details about what had happened in that Tampa condominium 28 years earlier. Though the specific motive and the meaning of the greed message have not been publicly disclosed. His willingness to confess suggests he recognized the DNA evidence left him with no viable defense. Gliha was charged with first-degree offenses related to Stephen's passing. The first-degree charge indicates prosecutors believe the evidence supports showing premeditation and intent. Not just that Gliha was present, but that he planned to take Stephen's life. As of the latest reports, Gliha's case is proceeding through the Florida court system toward trial, where prosecutors will present the DNA evidence, Gliha's confession, and any other investigative findings. Sheriff Chad Chronister addressed the resolution, stating, "After 28 years, we can finally give Stephen's family some measure of peace." The advances in DNA technology have allowed us to identify who was responsible and ensure they face justice. His statement emphasized both the closure provided by identifying Gliha and the importance of holding him accountable through trial and potential conviction. Stephen's family, who had waited nearly 3 decades for answers, faced the prospect of learning details about his final moments that had been unknown to them all this time. Gliha's confession likely provided information about what led to the confrontation, why the attack was so violent, and what the greed message meant. Whether those details will become public during trial proceedings remains to be seen, but Stephen's family will finally understand what happened to him and why. As Gliha awaits trial, Stephen's family processes the resolution of a case they had waited decades to see solved. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.